The moment the restoration expert noticed the third shadow was not dramatic at first, because it appeared in the way mistakes often do. Quietly, almost apologetically, as a subtle inconsistency that could be dismissed with the right excuse. Shadows in 19th century photographs were notoriously unreliable. Long exposure times allowed light to crawl across surfaces, and studio lamps were often moved mid-session. So, when a darker shape began to appear behind the girl, and the woman as the contrast was gently adjusted, the expert assumed it was nothing more than overlapping silhouettes or chemical staining from the plate's long burial in damp storage. Yet the more the image clarified, the less cooperative the shadow became. It did not behave like a shadow should. It did not soften at the edges or dissolve into grain. Instead, it grew more defined, darker at its center, as though it possessed weight. The expert checked the light logic of the scene, tracing where illumination should fall based on the highlights on the woman's cheek and the faint gleam on the girl's shoes. The studio light was clearly positioned high and to the left. That meant any shadow should fall to the right and slightly backward. The shadows of the girl and the woman obeyed this rule perfectly. The third one did not. It stretched straight down and then angled inward, creeping toward the space between them, as if drawn there by intention rather than physics. At first glance, the shape looked almost human, but not quite aligned with either body. It was too tall to belong to the girl, too narrow to belong to the woman. When the expert isolated the shadow layer, separating it digitally from the rest of the image, an unease settled in. Shadows are echoes, dependent on something solid to cast them. This one seemed independent, refusing to anchor itself to any visible source. No distortion or lens artifact could fully explain why its edges sharpened as the image was cleaned, instead of fading like the rest of the background noise. The expert zoomed in, studying the floor beneath their feet. The studio boards were visible now, worn smooth by years of use. The girl's shadow touched the hem of her dress. The woman's shadow pooled beneath her skirt. The third shadow, however, stopped short of the floorboards, hovering just enough to suggest separation. It was as if whatever cast it was standing closer to the camera than the subjects themselves, occupying a space that the photograph insisted was empty. As the restoration continued, the shadow subtly changed. It did not grow larger or smaller, but its density deepened, becoming almost opaque. The expert felt an unexpected resistance, a strange reluctance to refine that particular area further. Each adjustment produced a mild distortion in the software, brief flickers that resolved themselves only when the shadow was left untouched. This was not how damaged photographs behaved. Damage yielded when corrected. This felt like interference. What unsettled the expert most was the realization that the shadow did not align with time. Old photographs capture stillness because movement blurs into nothing. Yet this shadow retained clarity in a way that suggested it was perfectly still, as if it had known how long it needed to remain motionless to be recorded. The implication crept in slowly and unwelcome, that something present during the exposure understood the rules of the medium better than the people being photographed. The expert pulled archival references, comparing other studio portraits from the same photographer. The lighting setup was consistent across dozens of images, and none showed anomalies like this. No extra shadows, no doubling, just ordinary people caught in ordinary moments. This image was alone in its defiance. The more the expert stared at it, the more the shadow seemed to press forward, subtly narrowing the gap between itself and the figures it loomed behind. There was a final detail that tipped unease into certainty. When the expert inverted the image to inspect tonal balance, The third shadow briefly resembled a figure with shoulders hunched forward, head bowed, as if leaning in between the girl and the woman. In that inverted state, it almost appeared to be holding its own place in the composition, deliberately centered, deliberately included. When the colors returned to normal, the shape softened again, but the impression remained burned into the expert's mind. By the time the restoration reached a point where the photograph should have felt complete, the expert understood that the shadow was not a flaw to be corrected. It was evidence. It suggested that the photograph had captured more than two people, more than what the lens was meant to see. It hinted at a presence that had stood there willingly, patiently, knowing it would be preserved as darkness rather than form, content to wait until someone finally noticed it was never supposed to be there when the restoration advanced far enough to reveal the hands with unforgiving clarity. The expert felt the first true fracture in their certainty that the photograph belonged to any recognizable reality. Hands are intimate things in old portraits, often more honest than faces, because sitters struggled to control them. Fingers tensed, and knuckles betrayed age, and posture revealed relationships that expressions tried to conceal. At first, the joined hands of the girl and the woman appeared ordinary, clasped gently at waist level, a gesture of reassurance or familial closeness. But as scratches were removed and the emulsion's fog thinned, the anatomy of that grip began to contradict itself. The girl's hand should have been small, soft, and rounded, yet the bones beneath her skin emerged too prominently, the joints elongated in a way that suggested maturity rather than childhood. Her fingers were narrow, with tendons subtly raised, as though shaped by years of use. In contrast, the woman's hand appeared wrong in the opposite direction. The skin was smoother than expected for her age, almost waxen, and the fingers were shorter, stubbier, with proportions closer to a child's. The expert checked the negative scan, suspecting a reversal or distortion, but the tonal mapping confirmed what the eye resisted accepting. The hands did not belong to the bodies they were attached to. As the restoration sharpened further, texture replaced ambiguity. Fine cracks traced the woman's knuckles, not the shallow lines of dry skin, but deep fissures that suggested age far beyond her face. They resembled the splitting of old porcelain or weathered wood rather than living flesh. The girl's palm, meanwhile, bore faint calluses near the base of the fingers, marks earned through repetition and labor. It was a detail that refused innocence. Children of that era worked, yes, but not long enough to etch such history into their hands. The expert paused, unsettled by the sense that time itself had been redistributed unevenly across their bodies. The grip between them grew increasingly disturbing the longer it was studied. The woman's thumb pressed into the girl's hand with an intensity that felt more possessive than protective, while the girl's fingers curled not in trust, but in tension. There was strain there, a resistance captured mid-moment, as if one was pulling and the other was holding fast. The expert noticed that the pressure points aligned oddly, the woman's fingers sinking where bone should have resisted, the girl's grip meeting less mass than expected. It was as though each hand was interacting with something that did not fully exist in the present form. Then came the discovery that changed the way the expert understood the image entirely. Under magnification, subtle discolorations appeared along the woman's wrist and the girl's lower palm, faint rings where the emulsion darkened unnaturally. These were not stains or chemical burns. They were boundaries. The textures shifted abruptly at those lines, as if the material of the photograph itself recognized a seam. Below the woman's wrist, the tonal depth flattened, losing the organic variation of living tissue. It looked preserved, static, like something already finished long before the photograph was taken. The expert compared these details with medical illustrations and archival death photography from the same period. The resemblance was undeniable. The woman's hand carried the muted rigidity of post-mortem images, fingers arranged carefully, joints fixed in place. Yet the rest of her body showed no such signs. Her posture was relaxed, her face calm, her presence convincingly alive. The contradiction gnawed at logic. If part of her was dead, how could the rest stand so convincingly among the living? The girl's hand told a different, but equally unsettling story. The lines in her palm were unusually deep, intersecting in patterns more common in elderly hands. The creases spoke of decades, not years. It was as though her hand had lived a life longer than her face admitted. The expert began to suspect that the hands were not merely mismatched in age, but displaced in time, borrowed or exchanged in a way that defied natural continuity. What made the realization unbearable was the intimacy of the connection. The photograph did not show two separate anomalies. It showed an exchange. The grip became a point of transfer, a junction where histories overlapped. The woman's hand, frozen and spent, clung to the girl's with desperate insistence, while the girl's aged hand seemed to anchor something far older than herself. The expert could no longer see the clasp as an expression of comfort. It resembled a transaction, silent and final, captured at the exact moment when ownership changed. By the time the restoration reached full clarity, the expert understood that the photograph was not simply documenting two people standing together. It was recording an interaction that should not have been visible, let alone preserved. The hands were evidence of a boundary being crossed, of time folding in on itself at the point where flesh met flesh, leaving behind a trace that no amount of careful correction could ever erase. The inscription was not visible at first, not even as a suggestion, because it existed in a place the eye rarely lingers when studying a photograph. It rested along the woman's wrist, half obscured by shadow and the natural curve of her arm, where the tonal range dipped just enough to hide irregularities. Only after hours of incremental refinement did faint lines begin to surface, shallow as scratches, thin as hair. The restoration expert initially mistook them for damage, the kind left by a careless fingernail or a flaw in the glass plate. But unlike random abrasions, these lines followed intention. They curved, paused, and resumed, forming shapes that were too deliberate to ignore. As clarity increased, the marks resisted alignment with any known language. They were uneven in depth, some strokes fading abruptly, while others pressed dark and certain into the emulsion. The expert adjusted exposure and sharpness, expecting the shapes to either dissolve into noise or resolve into something recognizable. Instead, they remained stubbornly ambiguous. The more legible they became, the less sense they made. There was rhythm there, spacing that suggested letters, yet nothing read correctly when viewed straight on. It was only when the expert noticed the unnatural symmetry of certain strokes that the idea surfaced, unwelcome and absurd at first. The markings appeared reversed, not simply mirrored by chance, but intentionally written backward. Acting on instinct, the expert opened a reflection view, flipping the image horizontally as one might do absent-mindedly to check balance. The effect was immediate and deeply unsettling. The scratches aligned. The broken lines connected. What had been nonsense became language. The inscription emerged with quiet clarity, as though it had been waiting for the correct angle to speak. The letters were small and cramped, etched with care, but not elegance, each one pressed into place rather than written freely. The expert felt a tightening in the chest at the realization that the message had never been meant for the camera. It had been meant for the photograph itself, for the reversed logic of lenses and glass, for the world behind the image rather than the one in front of it. Reading it brought no comfort. The words were simple, almost disappointingly so, but their simplicity carried weight. They spoke in the first person, yet did not claim a name. There was no date, no place, no context that could anchor them to a known event. The phrasing felt old-fashioned but not archaic, carefully chosen to endure. What disturbed the expert most was not what the words said, but what they implied. They did not describe a moment. They described a condition, something ongoing, something unresolved. The placement of the inscription deepened the unease. It wrapped partially around the woman's wrist, disappearing beneath the shadow cast by her sleeve, as if continuing out of sight. It was positioned where veins would run, where a pulse should have been visible in life. The expert magnified the area further, examining the interaction between the letters and the skin beneath. The texture changed subtly around the inscription, flattening, losing the organic variation present elsewhere. It looked as though the skin had accepted the writing, accommodating it rather than resisting it. The expert consulted forensic references, aware of how writing sometimes appears on bodies in historical contexts, whether through tattoos, scarification, or postmortem markings. None matched this. The lines were too fine to be scars, too irregular to be ink, too integrated into the photograph to be added later. They existed as part of the original exposure, meaning the inscription had been present at the moment the shutter opened. That realization carried an implication that was difficult to articulate. That the woman had stood there knowing the words were on her, knowing how they would be recorded. There was another detail that refused to settle. When the image was returned to its original orientation, the inscription vanished again into abstraction. It could not be read unless the photograph was mirrored. This suggested intention layered atop intention. Someone had anticipated the mechanics of photography well enough to understand reversal, well enough to exploit it. The expert wondered whether the woman herself had written the words, or whether they had been placed there by someone else, someone who understood exactly how to hide a message in plain sight. As the expert reread the inscription in reflection, the words began to feel less like a statement and more like a warning, though no explicit threat was made. They addressed no one directly, yet seemed to wait for a reader. The expert became uncomfortably aware of the act of looking, of fulfilling a role the photograph appeared to require. The message did not change with repeated readings, but its meaning deepened, as if unfolding slowly over time, rather than all at once. The final and most disturbing realization came when the expert compared the handwriting to other elements in the photograph. The curvature of the letters echoed the angle of the clasped hands. The spacing mirrored the distance between the girl and the woman. The composition itself seemed to reinforce the message, as though every element had been arranged to support it. The inscription was not an addition to the photograph. It was part of its structure, a hidden axis around which everything else turned, waiting patiently for someone to turn the image around and finally see what had been written there all along and never meant to be read straight on the archival records. Were meant to settle doubts, not deepen them, and the expert approached them with the quiet confidence of someone who believed that history, however fragmented, eventually aligned. Names, dates, studio ledgers, burial registries, census entries, all the cold, orderly documents that reduced lives to ink and paper. The photograph bore a studio stamp on the reverse, faint but legible once cleaned, along with a penciled notation of the sitting date. 1899. That single year became the anchor point, the assumption upon which everything else would rest. The girl and the woman had stood together in that moment. The camera had seen them. The plate had recorded them. Whatever strangeness the image contained, it must still obey the boundaries of time. The girl's name appeared first, traced through baptismal records and school registries. She was born in the early 1890s, the dates consistent with her apparent age in the photograph. There were mentions of her family, brief notes about her attendance, her father's occupation. Then, without drama or elaboration, the entries stopped. A death record surfaced, dated several years before the photograph was taken. The cause was mundane, the kind that filled ledgers without ceremony. There was no ambiguity in the handwriting, no smudge that could be misread. The girl had been buried. Her life concluded on paper well before the camera shutter was ever opened. At first, the expert assumed an error, a common enough occurrence in records of that era. Dates were miscopied, names reused, children named after lost siblings. But cross-referencing confirmed the truth with an indifference that felt almost cruel. The address matched. The parents' names matched. The burial location matched. There was no second child, no later correction. According to every official account, the girl in the photograph could not have existed in 1899. Unease sharpened into something colder when attention turned to the woman. Her name proved more elusive, appearing in fewer records, as though she had moved frequently or avoided documentation. Eventually, a match emerged in a municipal register, listing her as a resident at the same address as the girl's family. Her age aligned with her appearance. There were employment notes, a signature that appeared on a rental agreement. Then, abruptly, nothing. No death record. No relocation notice. No marriage certificate. Just absence. The final notation in the archive placed her alive and present mere days before the photograph was developed. The expert followed the trail outward, searching newspapers, hospital admissions, police logs. People did not simply vanish without leaving some ripple, some mention. Yet the woman's name dissolved into silence after that date. It was as if she had stepped out of the written world entirely. The contrast was unbearable in its symmetry. One subject officially dead before the photograph, the other officially gone immediately after. The image stood between them like a hinge, connecting two disappearances in opposite directions. What made the discovery truly disturbing was the development log from the photography studio. The plate was processed on a specific afternoon, noted by the same hand that recorded dozens of other jobs that week. There was a brief remark beside the entry, an unusual deviation from routine. The note referenced a delay, a difficulty in fixing the image properly, as though the exposure resisted settling. The expert imagined the photographer watching the forms emerge in the chemical bath, unaware of what else might be surfacing alongside them. The implication settled slowly, heavily. If the girl had died years earlier, then the photograph had not captured her living body. And if the woman vanished the moment the image was fixed, then perhaps the photograph had taken more than it gave. The expert found themselves rereading the dates, hoping for contradiction, but the records remained unmoved. Time had wrapped itself around that single image in a way that defied linear explanation. There was a temptation to rationalize, to frame the photograph as a symbolic composite, a posthumous tribute, a trick of memory rather than reality. But the physical evidence resisted metaphor. The hands were real. The shadows were real. The inscription had been present at the moment of exposure. Whatever stood in front of the lens that day had cast light and blocked it, had occupied space, had insisted on being recorded. The expert began to consider a possibility that felt dangerously close to belief. That the photograph was not a passive record, but an active boundary, a place where the dead could appear and the living could be unmade. The girl, already lost to time, had found a way back into visibility, while the woman had paid for that visibility with her own continuity. The camera, indifferent and mechanical, had accepted both conditions without question. By the time the expert closed the final archive ledger, the photograph no longer felt like a mystery to be solved, but a transaction to be understood. It marked a precise exchange, a moment when absence and presence overlapped just long enough to be fixed onto glass. The records did not contradict the image. They completed it, confirming that what the photograph showed was not an error or illusion, but a rare alignment where one life returned from the past and another quietly stepped out of the future. The final enhancement was never intended to reveal anything new, only to refine what was already known, to smooth the last imperfections before the photograph could be archived as complete. By that point, the expert believed they understood the limits of what the image could offer, even if those limits were deeply unsettling. The girl, the woman, the impossible shadow, the reversed inscription, the broken timeline. All of it formed a closed circle of meaning. Nothing more should have been hidden. Yet when the last layer of noise reduction and depth correction was applied, something shifted in the negative that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Between the girl and the woman, in the narrow space their bodies framed, a faint distortion appeared. It was not a figure at first, only a soft blur that thickened the air like breath caught on glass. The background paint seemed to bend around it, the floral backdrop losing coherence, as though refusing to describe whatever occupied that space. The expert adjusted the focus region, isolating the area with careful precision, and the blur responded by gaining definition, not clarity, but intention. As the enhancement progressed, the suggestion of a hand emerged. It was not fully formed, not attached to any visible arm, but its outline was unmistakable. Long fingers extended outward, positioned exactly where the clasp between the girl and the woman occurred. The expert felt a slow tightening in the chest, the sensation that comes when the mind recognizes a pattern it does not want to name. The hand did not replace either of theirs. It completed them. The grip made sense only in retrospect. The strain visible in the girl's fingers, the unnatural pressure of the woman's thumb, the sense of resistance frozen in the image. All of it aligned when the third hand became visible. It slid between theirs, palm facing inward, as though it had been there all along, mediating the connection. The photograph had not shown two people holding hands. It had shown three, with the central presence carefully erased by time, light, and the limitations of the medium. The expert examined the tonal values, expecting inconsistency, but the hand obeyed the same rules of exposure as the rest of the image. It blocked light where it should, cast a faint shadow where it must. Yet it remained partially transparent, its edges dissolving into the grain. It was neither fully present nor fully absent. The most disturbing realization was that the girl and the woman's hands aligned naturally around it, their fingers curved to accommodate something with substance. As clarity increased, the hand appeared to be pulling inward, not toward the camera, but into the depth of the photograph itself. The angle of the fingers suggested tension, a slow, steady force drawing both subjects toward the space between them. The girl's posture, once merely stiff, now looked strained, her shoulder angled slightly inward. The woman's stance mirrored it, her body leaning just enough to suggest resistance. They were not standing side by side. They were being drawn together. The expert noticed that the edges of the photograph behaved strangely near the center. Grain tightened, contrast deepened, as if the image were thickening there. It resembled the visual distortion seen near deep water or heat shimmer, an indication of depth where none should exist. The background seemed to recede unnaturally, creating the illusion of a hollow space opening behind the figures. The photograph was no longer flat. It suggested an interior. When the enhancement reached its limit, the third figure became briefly visible in full. Not sharply, not in detail, but enough to confirm form. A torso suggested by shadow. A bowed head implied by the curvature of darkness. The hand extending forward with deliberate precision. It occupied the space between the girl and the woman as though that space belonged to it by right. The expert stared, aware that this was not discovery, but confirmation of something the image had been quietly preparing all along. What followed was the most unsettling realization of all. The photograph did not depict an intrusion. It depicted completion. The girl and the woman were incomplete without the third presence. Their mismatched ages, their borrowed time, their conflicting states of life and death all resolved at that central point. The hand was not taking them. It was joining them, binding what did not belong together into a single, stable moment. The expert understood then why the woman vanished after the photograph was developed and why the girl appeared despite her recorded death. The photograph had not captured a meeting. It had sealed it. The third presence was the mechanism, the silent intermediary that allowed the exchange to occur. Once the image was fixed, the balance it required could not be undone. As the expert prepared to close the file, there was a brief, almost imperceptible change on the screen. The third hand's fingers appeared to curl slightly tighter, the pressure between all three grips increasing, just enough to suggest movement. The expert froze, aware that no further adjustments were being made, that the software was idle. The photograph had already been restored as far as it would allow. In that stillness, the expert was struck by a final thought that refused to fade. The image was not finished because it had been fully revealed. It was finished because it had taken what it needed, leaving behind a record of the moment when two lives and something else entirely were pulled into alignment, preserved forever in the quiet certainty of silver and shadow